Yeah. Thank you. Next time. Yeah, so good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome and thank you for coming. My name is Ian Whittaker. I'm the Assistant Director for Programs at the Chicago Council. We're delighted to welcome this evening's panelists, Steve Pemberton, Rick Wartzman, Amy Webb, and our moderator, Paul Earle. You will see a series of images on our screens throughout the program and on the back wall. These photos are part of a documentary series called Working in America. They're developed by Project And. The full set of images taken by Lindsay Aderio, curated by Jane Sachs in collaboration with Studio Gang, are currently on display at the Harold Washington Library or at working.org. I'd recommend you check them out. They explore the relationship between people and their work and a great fit for this evening's program, so we were glad to partner with Project And. Before we begin, please note we are on the record, we're live streaming, we welcome social media, but please silence your phones before we begin. And please also note that views expressed by individuals that we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions of the Council. For upcoming programs, please see the Council's website. Two very quick highlights. On March 2nd, Tyler Cohen of George Mason University will chart the fortunes of the American middle class and the prospects for the American dream. And on April 11th, we have a half-day symposium which will ask the question, is democracy in retreat? That features Arthur Brooks, Larry Diamond, E.J. Dionne, Yascha Mounk, and Constanza Stelzenmüller, among many others. So turning back to this evening's program, I look forward to discussion on the changing world of work. After the panel, Paul will moderate the audience Q&A. You can raise your hands. You can also ask questions online. Just go to the link you see on our screen. It's chi.cnf.io. Put that straight into your browser. You can ask a question. You can vote on other people's questions. But now to formally introduce our speakers, please join me in welcoming Associate International Economist at the Northern Trust and Chicago Council Young Professionals Ambassador, Aisha Montgomery.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Council on Global Affairs, thank you for joining us tonight. America's workforce is on the cusp of momentous change. Robots, 3D printers, and advanced computing are predicted to create significant job losses over the coming decade. It has been claimed that autonomous vehicles alone could cost up to 3 million jobs. Yet optimists contend that technology could also create entirely new careers while augmenting human labor and brain power. The U.S. workforce is also becoming more diverse and older. Workers with broader skill sets, experiences, and perspectives will greatly benefit American companies, but only if employers know how to adjust to the changes. Finally, wages and benefits are decreasing as traditional career structures become less common and employers drift into the gig economy of flexible, part-time, and contractless work. How should we rethink our definitions of career, education, and retirement? How can policymakers, corporations, and unions prevent today's workforce revolution from widening inequality? I look forward to a conversation this evening with a panel of experts who have given much thought to these questions. By way of brief introduction, Simon Pemberton is Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at Walgreens Boots Alliance. He is an expert on issues of diversity and inclusion in the workplace and has presented at the White House on this topic. Rick Wartzman is a Senior Advisor at the Drucker Institute at Claremont University, California. He is also the author of the forthcoming book, The End of Loyalty, The Rise of Good Jobs in America, which will be published in May. Amy Webb is a futurist and founder of the Future Today Institute. She is author of the recently published book, The Signals Are Talking, Why Today's Fringe is Tomorrow's Mainstream. And our moderator, Paul Earle, is an adjunct lecturer of innovation and entrepreneurship at Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management. He is also the executive director of Farmhouse, the Innovation and New Venture Center of Global Marketing Agency Leo Burnett. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming this evening's panelists.
Thank you very much. I'll start by saying I'm just happy to be here at all. You know, we're talking about workforce automation, and I will say that driving into this event, I imagined a robot sitting where I'm sitting now. And of course, if it were a robot, I hope it would be the Lost in Space robot, Danger, Will Robinson, all that stuff. Anyone remember the Lost in Space? Okay, all right. So I'm dating myself a little bit. This is a thrilling and important and highly relevant subject tonight. we're talking about, the nature of work, the availability of work, the future of the workforce itself. And I was just thinking that gets to a number of increasingly serious cascading issues. The future of work pertains to the future of our economy, which pertains to global security, which pertains to people, the future of humanity. So this is serious stuff. We're really designing and predicting and shaping the future here, and we only have like an hour and 15 minutes to do that. So no pressure. We'll figure out how to do that. I'd like to start by talking about the gig economy. We've all heard about the gig economy. Amazing statistic based on a LinkedIn study that was recently released. By 2020, which is basically tomorrow in the grand scheme of things, a stunning 43% of the workforce will be freelance. That is not a typo. 43% of the workforce will be basically comprised of private contractors by 2020. I'd like to start with Rick. What's going on here? Is loyalty dead? Is it completely a bygone concept at this point?
I think in a lot of ways it is, although not just because of the gig economy. One, just note, my book that's coming out in May is actually called The Rise and Fall of Good Jobs in America, not just the rise of good jobs in America. So that'll give you a little more insight into maybe where I'm coming from. A couple quick things, and Amy, you may know way more about this. I think that 43% number, there are various estimates floating around just about the size of the gig economy. There are even different ways. Obviously, you define what the gig economy is, and that helps you figure out how to measure it. So if you're talking about freelance type work, the estimates really go from about 15 or 16% of the economy currently, and those numbers come from Larry Katz and Alan Kruger, two very prominent economists.
Real news, not fake news, for the record. Right.
And they're definitely real news. And the way they define it is people who, and actually it's not just freelancers, it's people in alternative work arrangements, so part-time agency workers and others. But their narrow definition is people who make the majority of their income. That is their primary source of income. And so they have a narrow definition. I don't know about the LinkedIn. If you get to the bigger definition, which the Freelancers Union uses, McKinsey Global Institute uses, you begin to sweep in people who make some money on the side often in a freelance role. And so it may not be their primary source of income. So I think it's important, one, just to define the universe that we're talking about. All that said, this is clearly a rising phenomenon. There are more and more people who will work outside of traditional employment structures. And with it comes a host of really important social issues, right? How will they get health benefits? How will they get retirement security? Do they have other workplace protections and labor standards that many of us in traditional organizations take for granted? And so it raises a whole host of really important issues that way.
And I'd add to that stress. It's very, very stressful to be a private contractor, and there have been a number of studies that have been released talking about a general rise in anxiety in our workforce because you're singing for your supper every day. You don't know exactly where the next paycheck is coming from. And so that leads to the question, why? Like why, obviously there are changing dynamics at the corporate level, but there's also an increasing desire, especially amongst younger people, the millennials, to have more freedom and more flexibility and more control over their intellectual property, which we'll get to in a minute. But what are the drivers? And I'd like to throw that out to the whole panel as well. What's going on here?
Well, I think what's going on is that we all suffer from something that as a futurist, I call the paradox of the present, which is that our frame of reference is very much shackled by our existing experiences. And, you had mentioned the robot. How many people in here know what I mean when I say Jetsons car? Raise your hand. Okay. How many people, of the people raising your hands, keep them up. I'll do it too. How many of you have seen an episode of the Jetsons? I haven't.
Oh.
Okay. And some of you put your hands down. And my point is that's such a strong cultural touch point that it has become synonymous with self-driving vehicle. Even if you know what a Jetsons car represents, which is why we continue to keep building cars that fly, which is a separate.
Out, by the way. It's Great show.
It's a highly recommended.
It's a separate issue, but
Just saying.
A lot of binge watching to do.
I mean, I could actually, I now have seen an introduction. We could go have a whole conversation about
incredible vision
moving
of the
sidewalks.
future.
But,
We know the theme song, I bet.
okay, but here's my point. My point is that we are, as humans, we are hampered and limited by our own biology. And so our brains, in order to save energy, are constantly looking for patterns. So we constantly reference what we know to be true. What we know to be true is the company pays us and provides for us, and we do work for it, and that's the way things go. In the year 2017, the thing that does a lot of those elements is the platform, right? So the thing, it's no surprise to me that, we saw last year 420 startups claiming to be the Uber for whatever, Uber for
the
wash.
Airbnb of blank.
Right, and the reason, so again, this goes into this, we think of patterns. So while, a lot of people lament the future in which automation obviates jobs, and people love to hate the gig economy. But what we're really talking about are platforms. And if you start so this is where, like, if you unshackle yourself from what you know to be true, right, and think and define platform in a different way, we can start then getting past these conversations of the company took away my insurance, my way of life as I know it is different, and get to the point where we can start building on what's coming next. So if you sort of think a little differently, there's like an SAT analogy here. The previous definition of company is how we may now define platform, and there are on that wheel, right, many different spokes that still imply things like insurance and labor law and everything else that just look different than we are used to, and therefore we don't recognize them, even though they exist, and we don't understand how to interpret them and relate to them because we haven't been in that situation before.
Is this change permanent? I mean, are we past the point of no return, or things are cyclical, right? They go up, they go down, trends begin, they end, they reverse. Are we past the point of no return on the gig economy?
I don't know if you're looking at it through generational lens for an older workforce, the evolution of that change is they're going to see it and they won't see it reverberate back. I do think, though, there's a certain degree of permanency that we'll see. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to move out of my office for a period of 12 to 14 weeks at Walgreens, and we're going to completely deconstruct all of our buildings, particularly my floor, all open spaces, open environments, much more collaborative, driven by a workforce that, particularly millennials, who are demanding this. So there's going to be a period of permanence, I would suggest. But things do have a way of coming full circle as well.
Well, one follow-on question is, what does this mean for humanity, right? I mean, the company was not only the source of your income, it's where you met people. It's where you collaborated. It's where you had lunch with the same group of people every day. If you're part of a team of contractors, mercenaries, basically, you could essentially be.
You're so down on the gig economy.
No, I'm not. I'm running my own platform too.
In your future, like, nobody has friends.
No,
we're tethered to our computers in the dark, wearing hoodies because we're millennials.
I am the optimist of optimists, and I actually think there's a great benefit that could come from. So, bear with me. Okay. I'll get there later. One implication we have to keep in mind is the notion of collaboration is changing, because you might not be in the same physical location as the other people on your team.
And you're assuming that collaboration is just between humans.
Well, it could be between machines too.
It is already. I operate in a collaboration between artificially intelligent machines on a daily basis. So again, you have to unshackle yourself from what you know to be true. And the intrinsic human qualities that have bound us to our companies just look different going forward. And it's difficult because you may not, we haven't seen that in a Hollywood movie yet. It's difficult to think that through, but it's incumbent upon all of us to do that, because those of us who don't are the ones who get left behind. And we, over and over again.
No, I couldn't agree more, and I'm not even suggesting that we should hang on to some traditional model that is disappearing, and I would actually argue has been disappearing for a long, long time, really since the late 50s, which may surprise some people, but one of the things in researching my book that I found that even as sort of the traditional structure was still cresting in some ways, and this is probably the way the future works a lot, the wave is still cresting. And so things like job security were still very strong, and there was still a rise in traditional employer-based healthcare benefits, much better than most people have now. And there were still guaranteed defined benefit pension plans, and all that stuff was still going in this direction. The undercurrents were starting to tug in the other direction. Mm-hmm. And so you asked about the forces. What's happened at a corporate level is there are a whole bunch of them, and we know them, right? There is automation and technological change. There's globalization and the pressures that arise in foreign competition have brought on at least employers here and everywhere around the world. There has been a lot of push really since the mid-70s and accelerating through the 90s and through today to maximize shareholder value and put shareholders ahead of workers in terms of who gets what. And so all these forces combine to make it so that employers look and say, whether it's through freelancers or other contractors, they want to shed costs, and they unfortunately see employees a lot of times not as assets but as costs. Mm-hmm. And so that is really driving a lot of what's going on. The last point I would make is that I think as a result of that, there's sort of two fundamentally groups of workers that emerge out of that picture. One, and maybe it's the way we're talking about millennials generally, which we should never do, but we have been, which is people who are well educated, who have skills, who've gone and gotten degrees, are going to by and large, I think, do okay and can do okay and will emerge in this world you're talking about. And I think they're going to be fine. I think my
Can I
kids
ask you
will be
why?
fine.
Can I ask you, is it because the assumption is that younger people get technology and therefore they'll be okay? Is that the reason?
No. I'm saying I think there's a group of them that if they have skills and degrees and education, they'll be fine. But there's a whole other group, including, but I don't think they're generally talked of as the millennials. There's a whole other group of, I think, of undereducated and underskilled and undertrained and retrained people who will not fare well in this economy.
I think this is an important point that never gets made, and that is millennial is so again, oftentimes we humans in the business world define time by chunks that make sense to us, 10-year spans, 20-year spans. So we have this group of millennials that we've defined, and the thing that we forget is that the very oldest millennials have a completely different relationship with technology than the very youngest millennials. The very oldest millennials, I'm one of them, all right? I think I'm technically generationless, but my group knows a world both with computers but not lots of internet, and a work world where the internet was part and parcel of our everyday lives. The youngest people on that spectrum, their reference point is mobile and ubiquitous access that they didn't have to pay for. So the challenge when you are thinking about the future of work and this enormous group of people who have spanned a transformational period in our history as it relates to technology is that it's dangerous to make assumptions about how that group will fare. So,
back to your question of humanity, I wonder if it signals something a bit deeper, though, and whether or not the gig economy and the rise of freelance work and the like is a sign of a declining faith in a lot of the traditional institutions upon which American society largely has been built. We just emerged from a presidential election. A lot of things have been written about it, of course, but one of them was whether or not this is a sign of us losing faith in democracy at its fundamental core element. And then you do have a generation that has seen, as Paul rightly points out, who has seen their parents really subsumed and consumed by the corporation with very little loyalty to them. and as evidenced by the economic collapse in 2008. And I think that there's a reverberation effect accordingly. And that, I feel, is if we don't get our handle on that, we can debate ad nauseum about how we adapt and adjust in our environments. But if that is indeed the case, that the loyalty is to the I and not to the collective, then we're going to have much deeper issues.
That's right. Well, and by the way, that holds true not just for business, but for anything. So that's a very, very sage and important point. So Amy, this will make you feel good. So I am optimistic about the
I'm
gig
not an
economy.
optimist. I'm not like one of these techno-optimist people. I feel a constant sense of doom because of what I do, but I'm optimistic that we can all do something about it.
I never want to hear a futurist say, I feel a constant sense of doom. That's usually the sign of a... But I think there is cause for optimism in the gig economy, and it's because the very nature of being a private contractor, a sole proprietor, is intense entrepreneurship. It's the very definition of entrepreneurship, and I think ultimately the entrepreneurial zeal is what drives progress, not just the economy, but progress. And if we can kind of fuel the fire of entrepreneurship through all of these, this mass influx of new private contractors, we'll be in pretty good shape. And so the necessity is the mother of invention, right? So that's why I think that there should be cause for hope. But let's go on to another really important and very weighty, massive trend going on, and that is the movement towards the automated workforce. Here's another whopper for you. 47% of jobs are at risk due to what Oxford University calls computerization. 47% of jobs, and by the way, there's a really interesting sidebar to that same study where of the people who said, yeah, most jobs are going to be, or so many jobs are going to be at risk because of computers, 80% said, not mine though. So that's kind of an interesting element there. Amy, talk to us, please, if you would, about this massive conversion from human labor to machine labor.
So we happen to be at a strange moment in time that's part of a much longer cycle. As a futurist, I practice what's called elastic thinking, so I have to look back and look forward at the same time using data and evidence. And throughout many, many previous periods in human history, lots of jobs have gone away due to technology. This should not be news to anybody. So we are the unlucky ones who happen to be part of this current cycle, which is to say that yes, there are going to be a lot of jobs obviated by the emergence of AI, but that's not happening tomorrow.
Artificial intelligence.
Artificial intelligence. And AI, by the way, is a little bit like saying the internet. So within AI, there are things like machine learning and heuristics and lots of other subfields and that all have to sort of advance and work together. And AI itself goes back more than 100 years. We just happen to be at a point where we have enough compute power and people and progress that we're now starting to see bits and pieces of it work. But here's what that means. There's a sense, I think, that automation is going to eliminate huge swaths of jobs. And what people don't understand, because we don't have a reference point for it, is that we'll also create many, many more jobs. And let me give you a concrete example. So IBM Watson is not just a cool computer that was on Jeopardy. It does many other things. There was a patient in Tokyo that had a cancer. She went in, doctors looked at her, treated her, best doctors in the region. She wasn't getting better. And they enlisted the help of Watson, fed her data in through this massive corpus. Watson said, these are the 10 possible diagnoses. And because she didn't have markers for every one of them, the doctors, again, this, through no fault of their own, besides the fact that they are biologically limited by what's in their heads, right? They missed one of the possible things that was wrong. They changed her protocol. She went into full recovery and she's totally fine. What this tells us is not that, because the headlines after this happened were, well, I guess, Dr. Watson will see you now, we don't need doctors anymore. And that's that's what we normally leap to. But what we miss are how all of the different ways our data and artificial intelligence will create an entirely new medical data ecosystem that doesn't exist yet. So we'll have doctors. We're going to need a whole bunch of MD, like cross-trained MD CS people who have, who understand computer science and medicine. Roboticists. So there's a whole field of nanobot technology that can pinpoint and deliver, medicine. So we need roboticists who also understand medicine. Those are top-level degrees, but we also need the people. Computers don't yet build the networks that service all of these things, so we're still going to need network operators. There's a whole bunch of jobs: network operators, systems, creators, ethicists, right? Nurse practitioners who understand how to do triage using all of these different tools. I could spend the next 6 hours for you and go through any field you want and do that exact same thing. So the challenge, but here's where we have an opportunity. And that is, while we are so fixated on all the jobs going away, that nobody is preparing for the jobs that are coming next.
That's
not
right.
a single university, not a single, and by the way, we have major catastrophic problems that have to do with diversity that are on the horizon because our databases and the algorithms that run them are built by white males who don't take into consideration other things. So there's all these other pieces that are just waiting to be built if somebody could stop fixating on the jobs are going away part.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to, I agree with a lot of that. I would add to it too, and I guess as a futurist and a historian, you have perfect equal voice
That's right.
between us.
That's right.
So I agree. We always, historically, and you see this in the 30s, this arose in the 50s, this arose in the 60s, the 50s and 60s, there were big congressional hearings and presidential commissions that looked at all this stuff and people worried. And in fact, we've always created more jobs than have been destroyed by automation and technology. And that's a really good thing. What concerns me, and I think you pointed in this direction, is those who will be hurt most in the transition.
That's right.
And so there are people, again, who are well-educated, who will not only get those top-level jobs, but who are even educated at all, who will get the other jobs, and they're going to do okay. The most vulnerable will see the easiest kind of to replicate by machine tasks eliminated, and we're already seeing that in different places. And to me, you're right. We don't retrain. We don't train.
Right.
We don't. And this goes from the way we do K through 12 public education, the way we do vocational education, or I guess now called CTE education, career and technical education. We don't do any of this.
If you don't go to college, it's like vocational education. Like we look down upon.
No,
which is ridiculous.
Which is a mess.
Right.
Community colleges aren't supported enough, and so on. So basically, my concern is in this transition, even if we do create enough jobs, and I think ultimately we will, the question is what happens to, so if you add up all the people in America right now who have 4-year college degrees, and add on people who have 2-year community college degrees, and add on all the people who have some kind of post-secondary technical certificate, you still end up just shy of half the adult population in the US. So what in the world happens to the other half of the population? And that's what I worry about. Well, that is one answer.
Are you going to ask us a question about UBI?
About
universal basic income.
Universal basic income is one thing that people are pointing to. Do you want to?
Well, you guys talk. I've been talking. Universal basic income.
Yeah, well, back on this point here, just for a second, because I think the challenge, and it's just some hard truths we have to face, that as we've had those technological pivots throughout time, there have been times we have aggressively reinvested and invested in moving along a population that we know is going to sit on the periphery of any technical change that's been true throughout time. The problem today is that we're not seeing those conversations. We're not seeing that leadership from any parts of society. There's almost this quote unquote, we'll talk about this when we talk a bit about diversity, this kind of othering of people, a misalignment between education. So this generation is going to get left behind. It's going to be uncomfortable. And it's going to create, talk about a disconnection from humanity, it's going to create long-standing generational divides that is going to reverberate across class, going to reverberate across diversity as well. But it's hard. It was hard then. It was hard then to make those investments. But we're dancing around the issue, and we've got to get, sometimes I think about my role as a chief diversity officer, and most days I have one of two roles. I have to either afflict the comfortable or comfort the afflicted. It's usually one of those two things. This is I'm more in this space, I think, where I've got to afflict the comfortable and make some hard demands about reinvestments in our educational system. I think about these political discourses. How in the world can we look at what's unfolding globally, other nations are making these investments in education and connecting it to careers in this automated society that is immutable, nothing you can do about it, and yet it doesn't even come up as a discussion point. I mean, how does that abide? How do we sustain that?
We have to figure out how to solve that. So I don't know how, but it's an outcome that has to be solved.
Absolutely. I mean, the other big change that has been in the background of all this is during the last big sort of transition from agricultural to manufacturing, you could move from the farm, you could get a factory job with essentially no education, elementary school education, and lots of people did. And so when, 25 to 35% of the workforce was in manufacturing from the post-war all the way really through the 70s. We saw rising wages. We saw a much more solid middle class. And now, obviously, you have 10% of the workforce in manufacturing, and even those jobs, you need a lot more skill than you once did. Again, for the unskilled, the undereducated, that is something that we've got to fix, or those people, they're being left behind, and they're going to be left behind more, I fear.
So I was riffing earlier today with a fellow cohort from the innovation community, and he was asking me what I was up to tonight, and I said, well, I'm doing this interesting event, and we're going to be talking about the automated workforce. We started talking about Isaac Asimov's 3 immutable laws of robotics. Anyone know what I'm talking about?
There's 4.
Are there 4? I was told there are 3. Okay, so
he added a fourth.
Not immutable, clearly.
He added a 4th.
So this is leading up to a key question here. So the three laws, and if there's a 4th, please introduce that. Number 1, the robot cannot injure people. Number 2, the robot must obey the orders of people. And number 3, the robot must protect itself, provided that it doesn't violate 1 and 2. Are we at risk of violating all 3 of Asimov's inviolable laws? And what is the 4th, by the way?
So he added a 4th. So Asimov was writing at around the time that the first winter, the AI winter
Incredible
happened.
foresight. Incredible.
Foresight or observation? I would argue that it was great observation of what was happening at the time and observing fringe thinkers. But basically he was saying, we've got to create a situation where the machines don't take over. And so he added a 4th one after the advent of AI.
Is this happening? Is this like the apocalyptic vision and warnings of Asimov? Are we there now? Is this going to happen?
So depending on who you talk to, on one end of the spectrum, some people who are very smart believe that we are living in a computer simulation. And that the machines have already taken over. And by the way, that would be Elon Musk. Okay.
Yeah, right.
And on the other end of the spectrum, people who work day to day in the trenches on AI, on a code level, because they are dealing with constant frustrations. They don't see within their lifetime a situation in which, we will be able to have an operating system for our lives. And that's pretty typical regardless of what field. You can pretty clearly see that we're in the much further future moving towards some kind of hybrid. So I just want to preface this by saying that this is data-driven. There are futurists who just talk in terms like sci-fi stuff all the time, who call themselves futurists but aren't futurists.
Right.
This is not that.
Yes.
I am a robot hybrid because I have equipment in my body, and if you have a pacemaker, you are a robot hybrid because you have equipment in your body. These are the things that we have a understanding of today, but there are lots of interesting things on the horizon like smart sutures. This is thread that is computerized, instead of getting staples, you get smart sutures that allow doctors to monitor you, ingestible bots that live inside of us and can report out data and whatever service our needs. There's a really phenomenally important researcher named Nicolay, who's at Duke, who is building not just exoskeletons that can, if you saw the World Cup, there was an exoskeleton that helped a quadriplegic kick out the first ball of the game. But he's built systems where primates are connected to machines and just think and move the machines around. He also has built a sort of internet of rat brains. And together, primates and rats, just having their brains connected to each other, are able to complete and solve tasks better than they could have on their own. My point is, we are inevitably moving towards human-machine hybrids that will, and that's like a lot of that work is already in progress. When we think about the future of robotics and work, we assume that robots will take over our jobs and then that's the end of the story. That's only one tiny chapter of the story. So there are lots of other use cases where we are working in symbiosis with machines. The machines are a part of us. The very nature of work as we know it will change. So again, I don't know how to drive this point home enough, but if you want to think through what does the future of work look like, you have to think through all these other areas of change. Otherwise, you're really just thinking about one industry and one field, and everything changes. So it will change, right, in some way. But you won't be prepared for what comes next.
Well, that's a great segue into a very important issue, and that has to do with public policy and economic policy as it pertains to the automated workforce. And the elephant in the room has to do with great questions about what the Trump administration is really going to do to help prepare our workers for this change that's happening, whether we like it or not. And I'm certainly not going to go into political ideology. First of all, I don't want anyone tweeting at me, so I'm a little bit cautious here. But critics of the president would argue that he thinks it's 1917 instead of 2017. So talk to us about what the U.S. government can do to help prepare our workforce for these tectonic plate shifts in technology. Are you concerned with what you're hearing from Washington these days, and what can be done about it?
In a way, we've touched upon it already, and we won't replow the ground that was the election, but we certainly know that one of the driving factors, of course, was the loss of some of those jobs that we have been talking about.
Coal miners, factory workers, etc.
Yes, but the inconvenient truth of all that was that automation replaced a lot of them. So you can make all the reinvestments that you want to, that you can't return something that is gone forever. It's a hard truth of an emerging technology. So what can the government do? Well, they can be students of history and see how reinvestments in retraining for jobs that were to come and will be coming as you have paradigm shifts in technology. They always create new opportunities. But if the development of skills, particularly for the broader mass, we're not talking about those who are highly educated and are going to schools to be trained accordingly, if the focus is not on those who are going to Amy's example of the analyst, for example, if there aren't reinvestments in creating that pool of talent, well, then we're going to be yet again in some kind of proverbial dead end. And that's something almost immediately that the U.S. government can do. I think that the Trump administration is going to come to that awakening. Right. Now, it may take some time for that awakening to happen, but at some point you're going to realize that you in order to create the sustainable economic model focused on the population that feels that they've been left behind, it's going to require some reinvestment. Now we're talking about the individuals too, by the way. So this idea that you're sitting in communities where some of my family comes from, and the job that you lost in the community, I think about New Bedford, Massachusetts, Xerox, Polaroid, Titleist, all had plants in that community. They're all gone now, and they're not coming back. But other jobs and opportunities will. So here's the real question, which I pose my own family. Are you going to be ready for the jobs that will come back to the community? And the hard truth of it, in a lot of cases, that answer is no.
Well, there are more technology jobs open today than we have people to fill them.
So I think there are a few things government can do, and I'm not terribly optimistic that they're going to do any of them. So one is they can use technology to do better matching between the skills that people have and the jobs that are available and will be available in the future. This is something the Labor Department can play an instrumental role in. There was an interesting piece that ran, I think, 2 days ago in the New York Times by Charles Duhigg, where he interviewed a bunch of folks, both labor leaders and executives and other folks like us, about some of what government can do and should do, and this was one of the recommendations from a former Obama Labor Department official who said, we've done a terrible job of this, but it's almost think of like LinkedIn for not just professionals, but for just, working class folks, and there could be much better job matching through technology. We need to, going back to where we started, we need to create portable benefits and a clear legal regime around that, and portable pensions, portable health care benefits. I will be political and say repealing the ACA, simply doing that is a terrible step in that direction, both for allowing people to find health care when they need it as independent, folks who may be between jobs and who are entrepreneurs. It does not help entrepreneurship. Right. And then finally, coming back to what we've talked about over and over, because I do think it's the key, to me, government, if I were president, my thing would be...
Is that possible, by the way?
No, not in any way. But my call would be for a moonshot. My moonshot would be really creating a system of lifelong learning in this country.
Right.
That would look at the whole system from beginning to end. And again, from
So what
the
would
way
that
we
mean?
do
Let's talk about that. What does that mean?
To me, that means, first of all, I think a lot of the answers are out there. There are all kinds of pilots that are being done all over the place and that have been done all over the place where good data and evidence has been amassed that certain approaches work. I think there's a lot of expertise and we know what works. I think there is often a lack of leadership and will to and courage and money to do those things. And I think and I'm going to shut up in a second, I think one of the fundamental problems politically is that these kind of investments take a long time to pay off. And most politicians work on a 2-year cycle or a 4-year cycle or at best an 8-year cycle. And it's hard to invest in something that may not have a return for a decade or 2 decades till you really see the fruits of it as a politician. And I think those things are fundamentally at odds, and I don't quite know what to do about that.
Well, on the top, go ahead, Amy.
I was going to say, so we advised the previous administration, we advised the White House, OSTP, and the State Department. And the challenge, we are not currently advising this administration. We don't have a Department of the Future in our country. We don't have a high level, and I wrote a pretty substantial argument for this in Politico about a month ago. The challenge is that, to your absolutely perfect point, the people who are elected officials who are writing policy and creating law, they're there for 2 years, or they're there for 6 years, and somewhere in there, they start campaigning again.
From the very beginning.
From the, yes.
Yeah, right.
And drinks for another time. We did have something called the Office of Technology Assessment. This was a little-known agency. Some of you are shaking your heads and know what I'm talking about. This was a little-known agency that employed people who are like me, who have backgrounds in economics and game theory, who are professionally trained futurists, and who are PhD scientists, and their job was to, in a completely nonpartisan way, do research, create projections, build data sets, and then educate our elected officials to help them make policy that makes better sense. And in its time, the OTA created 700 papers. Their job, by the way, was education. So their job was to sit side by side in meetings and help our elected officials think through the implications of their policy. Newt Gingrich defunded it in 1992 because he didn't see the point. And and I just want to let you know, this became the gold standard elsewhere around the world. So Sweden, Germany, all of these other countries to this day have something, have their own versions of the OTA modeled on our system. We no longer have it. And in the absence of that system, you wonder why technology has become politicized. You wonder why climate, I can't believe that there is such a phrase as climate denier. Right?
It was 70 degrees here yesterday.
Politics aside, it's like there's empirical, there's data.
Right.
Right? But the reason that we have gotten ourselves into this ridiculous, horrific situation is because we do not have people who are nonpartisan, or as nonpartisan as an American can be in the year 2017, who are helping our elected officials think through these very difficult problems. And as a result of that, we wind up with policy that is either so broad as to be completely meaningless, or we wind up with people trying to create SOPA and PIPA, which were incredibly restrictive recommended laws, right, that would have completely changed how the internet works. And we don't get to the point where we have that conversation until we're in crisis mode. So the reason that we almost had a brand new policy on whether or not technology companies have to create a backdoor into your phone is because of a horrific killing in San Bernardino, California, which pitted the FBI against the government, against Apple, right? We keep winding up in this horrible cycle because we don't have people who are dedicated to thinking this stuff through without allowing politics to get into the mix of it. And nothing will change. Education is very, very important, and afflicting the comforted and comforting the afflicted is also very, very important. But none of it matters ultimately if we don't change how we're thinking. And if we don't force the people who are in Washington, D.C. to change how they're thinking. Because technology, we've reached an inflection point. Unlike any other time in human history, technology is advancing so quickly that no amount of policy making can keep up with it. So we have to have a new way of thinking about policy, right? We have to change the way we're thinking. We don't like change, but if we don't do that, we're going to wind up a year from now having a conversation about some horrible thing that somebody did because we weren't prepared.
Yeah, go ahead.
One thing you said really just is an important point we haven't touched on at all, which is Leonard Woodcock, who was the president of the United Auto Workers, who followed Walter Reuther, the famous leader of the auto workers, once proposed creating a government department of the future.
I didn't know that. Who is this?
Leonard Woodcock was his name, and I think it also speaks to another important force we haven't mentioned at all, which is the decline of unions. A bit self-inflicted, mostly employer-inflicted, and they were an important counterweight to some of the corporate kind of forces that we've talked about, and also were really important in terms of training and retraining. They had apprenticeship programs and workforce development programs that are now almost gone in the private sector, as private sector unionization is below 7% in this country.
Well, I mean, and we see the decline of the company as a massive employer, so of course unions decline too. I mean, I'm happy to form a union around myself. I don't know, what good that would do as one guy.
That's not entirely true. Walmart has 2 million workers, and,
that's true.
And they've resisted unionization at every turn. So it's not entirely. It is not entirely because companies are smaller. I don't even know if that's
a good point.
But your point is about the individuated society. I am my own best advocate.
That's right.
Yes.
What we have been seeing lately, and by lately I mean just the last week, which I think, again, I'm looking for positives here, is reassuring, is that I think we're seeing an awakening of people's voices politically. We've been seeing what's going on at town halls, and so maybe people will realize that yes, they can be heard, yes, their vote does count, and maybe there will be change in Washington to have a Department of the Future. You don't think so? Okay.
Because I'm watching.
All right,
this.
Forget it.
No. But let's pursue that point. I'm watching the same town halls that you are.
Yeah.
And I am watching my honest reaction, particularly around ACA. And I'm watching. These are predominantly Republican town halls that I'm watching, and I'm watching this realization that, wait a minute, if you take this away from me, from my family, then our life is in jeopardy. And I'm thinking, well, where was that perspective during the election
Right.
then? Right. So it's almost
Right.
as if did you not understand perhaps what a repeal of ACA would mean? Did you not hear that? Or now do you all of a sudden realize, wait a minute, this is going to affect me after all? And it's the same point around where work is coming from as well. So do you not ask the harder question about where retraining is going to come from? Because these require deeper thoughts here than just reacting to that which you have lost.
I'm going to cook your noodle right now. So we're talking about we're talking about retraining the vulnerable portions of our population. People who are highly trained in subsets of, let's say, AI, right? They too will need to be completely, completely retrained.
Yep.
Otherwise, they become obviated too. So to your point about lifelong learning, and that sort of thing doesn't happen in a 4-year college setting. And one of my concerns is that we're so fixated on especially now that these technical skills, that like a philosophy, people laugh at philosophy majors, right? Or comparative lit or world religion, people would laugh. What are you going to do with that kind of degree? You're going to be able to critically reason, unlike everybody else, and you can learn the technical skills, right, in other places. And so some folks have, some people are talking about nano degrees.
Perhaps learn how to compromise.
Something like that.
Well, we've talked about, so far, two major forces affecting the future of the workplace, the gig economy and, of course, the rise in automation. There's a third big one, and it's really important, and that has to do with driving more diversity in the workforce. Demographics are changing. Certainly, it would seem like we've improved from, say, 1950. Obviously, more work needs to be done. I think what is in favor of continued improvement in diversity in the workforce is that it's good for business, right? So, Steve, would love your perspectives on this as VP of Diversity and Inclusion at such a giant company like Walgreens, where you can really make a difference in this field.
I mean, there are several collision points, though. Demographics aren't changing. They have changed.
They have changed.
This demographic destiny has arrived. It's here. It's immutable. It's not going anywhere. And not just that it's arrived, but where it's happening. So if I tell you that 1 out of 2 children born in the United States today are of color, and that's true. You might think, well, that's happening on the coast. That's happening in cities like New York and Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles in the West, or San Antonio. And in fact, it's where diversity is happening in communities like Lincoln, Nebraska, and Salt Lake City, Utah, that are becoming increasingly Latino. So now you have, and particularly this migration of diversity into the center of the country. The challenge is that we've always had this kind of corrective action like view of diversity. This is the right thing to do, righting a social wrong, a noble good. But the hard truth of it, and particularly as a business, if this is not viewed for us largely as a driver of two things: one, competitive advantage. So if our pharmacies in the communities like Lincoln, Nebraska, and Des Moines, Iowa as examples, if we are not serving that customer base that is increasingly diverse, that interacts with health and wellness differently, then we won't be relevant as a business, just hard truth. But at the same time, we have seen, and I have no intention of being politically correct here, when you have seen a rhetoric emerge in the last 18 months of othering, of portraying immigrants as having drained from America as opposed to having contributed to America, where African American people are labeled as being particularly just from the city, when that's not true. This narrative of imagery and how it is used actually to create dissonance in pitting people against one another, as opposed to seeing where differing views and perspectives actually drive innovation.
That's right.
So if you have a disability, for example, you do have to navigate the world differently. You do. But that also gives you a skill set, a perspective, a view of the world that actually can drive innovation. Not to mention, and we see this in our distribution centers, for example, where places like Windsor, Connecticut, Anderson, South Carolina, 38 40% of the people in those distribution centers actually have a disability and do, in most cases, their job better than those without a disability. And we didn't change the job, didn't change the standard, the expectation of performance. We simply asked the question, what is it that you can do? As opposed to that quiet question of, well, I'm not sure you're able to do those things. When we look at diversity as a driver of innovation, then it accelerates a lot of those conversations. But there's some hard truths. We're at a Sputnik moment. We have a major access problem. If you look at Bureau of Labor Statistics, where you see young girls abandoning STEM disciplines because of the messages they get as early as the 6th and 7th grade. When you have fewer African Americans graduating from medical school than they did in the 1970s. Those create employment bubbles that as employers or hospitals that we all of a sudden have to wrestle with. So this is certainly, we've got to start afflicting the comfortable here. We've got to start railing against these notions of black and brown people, misogynistic attitudes towards women, this kind of pat on the head with people of disability, and think that there is no broader price for America to pay. That's just a complete disillusion, and we are losing global competitiveness because of it. Walgreens is a global company. My last point on this, a lot of my global colleagues look at us, particularly around the areas of diversity, and very nicely, after a couple of glasses of wine, they'll say, you know, America, you're really not in any position to lead the rest of the world on diversity. Maybe you once were, but you're not any longer. Hard truths.
Well, look, creativity, in my opinion, is simply about connecting dots in new ways. You're creating new combinations of things based on connecting existing dots. And if all the dots are the same, you're not going to get any new combinations. So, indeed, diversity is a driver of creativity and innovation. I want to...
Could I just...
Yeah, go ahead.
It also matters at the top. So how many women are on Walgreens' board?
Plenty.
Plenty?
Plenty.
I don't know. I was asking. I'm not accusing.
Okay. Sounded accusatory.
But that makes you exceptional, actually.
That does.
Yeah.
Well, it had better be. 80% of our customer base are women.
But for the overwhelming majority of the Fortune 500, and we work with a lot of them, what's the 8% of corporate, if you're hitting
Closer to
8%,
5,
right,
yeah.
with women, and forget people of color. If you want to
Well,
depress yourselves,
in a lot of cases.
if you want to get really depressed, go home tonight, open up Google Images, and do a search on CEO. And I will spoil it for you. The very first woman that you see is CEO Barbie.
Oh.
And the first person, you're going to have to scroll a really long time before you hit a person of color. Part of the problem is that in our heads, we have a certain idea of what the CEO of a company looks like, the corporate board of directors look like, and that doesn't mesh with your 1 out of every 2, right? So we have to think about the people who are rising up, but we also have to think of our corporate structures where, everybody celebrated that Audi ad, the girls driving, right? And then really celebrated it once it hit, fire on social media. Do you know if any, Audi doesn't have women on its corporate board. So, and not people of color. So,
And I agree, we have to break through those barriers, but I would also say they do, because it is a club that is self-perpetuating in every way.
That's great, but
I'm saying about
we
who
all
serves,
agree, but how do you do that?
So I agree. So I think one thing is that we can put pressure on the they. I think that one of the things that, for all of you who care about issues like diversity, like pushing companies to be more socially responsible in all kinds of ways, I think there are already tools, there are technological tools, and there will be more and more of them for consumers to leverage their power.
And they are.
And I think they are. And I think that is one way that over time that we can make a difference.
There's an easy scientific answer to this. We all know that biodiversity is good, right? Biodiversity creates so it's common sense that having a more diverse workforce and more diverse companies are better. And every study shows that. So it's an attitude, but humans don't like change, right? So we have to get comfortable with change or we fall behind.
Well, two of our most enduring systems, the federal system of government predicated on checks and balances, said differently, diversity of thought. The one time that we use diversity as a verb is when it comes to investing our money. Right? We say we diversify,
right?
And why do you diversify? To mitigate risk. So if somebody comes to you and says, we're going to put all your money over here, nice to meet you, short conversation. But somehow when it comes to humans, we've associated diversity with risk, actually, and
That's
the
a really
wrong
great
kind of risk rather than
analogy.
mitigating risk.
That's a great analogy.
That is a great analogy. And so this has been an incredible conversation, you guys. Really enjoyed it. Steve, you talked about the importance of retraining. You know, there are so many people who need to learn new skills, that there's a paradigm shift going on. We need to retrain our people for relevance and success. You talked about afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted. What a wonderful mantra to take into any workplace. And I would argue life, frankly. It extends beyond what it says on your business card. Rick, you talked about, what about the other half? We have all of half the country being retrained to succeed in the world ahead. What do we do about, so many untold millions of people who are going to be left behind? That's not just an economic issue, it's a moral issue. And Amy, fantastic thoughts on rethinking the notion of a company. It's not a company, it's a platform, right? It's a totally different way to think about, the basis from which you work. And you also talked a lot about redefining what generations are based more on behavior, not necessarily the year you were born and the place you were born. So a lot of really, really interesting observations. So I'd like a round of applause for our panelists. We're going to open it up for some questions. We have exactly 12 minutes left. Let's start right here. Your hand went up first.
May I please beg you to listen to a contrarian point of view? I beg you, especially Amy. I am the Honorable Dr. Dale Pierre Lehman, founder and president of RoboWatch, www.robowatch.org. Please visit. I propose that we need to create an anti-robotic counter-revolution that directly opposes Barack Obama's robot revolution. You are making all the people in technology and in business are driving the future. I am a biologist. I observe homeostasis, cybernetics, control system theory. Technology is evolving as a positive feedback system out of our human control and understanding, and think about Moore's law and the law of accelerating returns and singularity theory.
All right.
Thank you,
Question
sir. You can
is,
take a seat, sir.
can we
Thank you.
apply singularity? Are you familiar with the predictions of singularity theory, which I'm going around the world, I'm saying tick-tock, tick-tock.
I think
so
we're
Excuse me,
one's
can you-
down
can
to
you-
duly
two
noted.
people
We had some
plus
questions.
Robo-Duck.
Thank you very much, sir. We have a question over here.
Come visit RoboWatch.
I have a question on diversity, and I have a question on diversity, and I'm trying to think how to phrase it.
Bluntly.
No, I'm very pro-diversity. When I was younger, what you would think of as diversity is affirmative action.
Sure.
Okay, that was what, okay. So now everyone talks about diversity, but I also went to a lecture where they say in all the different populations growing, the African American, the Hispanic, there are a lot of poor people that are not going to be well educated. That's where the growth is going to be coming now. So how do we get diversity? How do we get all these people with good skill sets? What is diversity today? It's not just affirmative action pushing people in. It is, what gets to diversity today? I guess that's my question.
Yeah. I mean, certainly the origins of affirmative action were that you had people eminently qualified in who could not simply find opportunity. Arthur Fletcher really was the father of affirmative action. So this idea that affirmative action required a lowering of standard and expectation, which is some of the pushback against affirmative action, that was never quite the case, never quite the intention. I think diversity, to me, has as much to do with one's experiences as it does with those things that you see, right? So, and that's, as our population has grown and evolved, the fact of the matter is that you don't know who's raising who, you don't know who's married to who, you don't know anyone's life experiences just by looking at them. And yet that's what we run to all the time. And if you don't believe me, just look at your social media timelines, watch the news, watch most political discourse, you see the ways that so that's not working. It's working for some folks, but not effectively, not sustainable. Diversity is a lot less about what you look like, more about what you've seen, what you've experienced, and most importantly, what are you willing to learn? So a lot of the pillars historically of diversity, unconscious bias, which I have very little use for. Because what I see today is conscious bias, deliberate, relentless, purposeful bias that we all need to raise our voice to. I have to have conversations with a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old in my house about my son just got his permit this last weekend. And I was literally in the driveway of my house walking him through how he is to react should he ever get pulled over by a police officer. Anybody else here having those conversations? Okay, but not the majority of you. So does that make you unaware of diversity? No, but you at least ought to recognize that those of us who raised our hand, we have to have those discussions. They're necessary. That doesn't disqualify you, though. So I suspect if we sat down for a bit of time, I'd find mutual chapters between my story and your story. But I got to have the conversation with you, and you've got to have it in turn with me. That's not the current discourse. The point about innovation and experiences, and it's true for any community that's found itself on the periphery, think about what people have come from, what they have endured in a lot of cases. And the last point here, the difficulty we're having. If you go to some of the communities around Chicago and you drive through them and you look at the educational institutions in particular and the state of disarray that they are in, and in the quiet of my own heart, I'm really thinking, what kind of chance do you have when you are facing, from the day you walk out of the door, and these children have done nothing wrong. They just shown up in the world. But the pillar that is education that allows us to accelerate through society, they're being robbed, denied of those choices while we run around talking in ways that don't sail at the core of the problem. You got me started on a second book here, Paul.
You heard it here first. This is a scoop. It's the second book. So, interesting bit of irony. The format is that we take some questions from the crowd and also from the online community, but the technology is not working, which is probably leading to some. Yes, right there, sir, with the white shirt. You're next. But
Everybody's got a white shirt on.
That's right. I'm sorry. With the tie.
Just wanted to touch on a trend that we see in our economy with declining productivity, and I think economists define that as, how much output are we putting out for a number of labor units that we have. We've gone through a tremendous period here where explosion of technology. We've gone through a period of globalization, which has dropped our cost of producing things, and I'm just wondering if the panel would touch on why they think the trend is there and why it isn't being broken or it's continuing to trend downward.
And let's answer quickly so we can squeeze in one more question before we wrap.
Seems like a question for you.
I mean, my own sense of it is I'd fall a bit on the side that it's probably not being counted very well and that we're undercounting. I'd be actually lying with some of the Silicon Valley folks like Hal Varian who think we're not picking up in some of the productivity measures, some of the advances in the kinds of actually things that Amy was talking about very well. I think the statistics are probably lagging in a lot of ways. Just one quick note on that: those who say technology, the robots are not taking our jobs, point to that as well as sort of GDP growth to say if we really were having a boom in robotics and automation, you'd be seeing it especially in the productivity statistics, and we're not. But again, I think it's probably just missing a lot of stuff. That's my short answer.
Let's get a question from back here. You really want to ask a question? Okay, you're next, and then we'll do one more from back here.
So Steve, earlier in your talk, you mentioned how your company is moving to an open office floor plan. Mm-hmm. Susan Cain made a career talking about how society is biased towards extroversion, starting with children being forced to learn in clusters instead of rows of desks. Amy, you mentioned entrepreneurship and how that's a wonderful value in our society. But my question is, we've talked about folks being left behind, and there are a lot of groups who are marginalized. What about the educated people who are just made of a certain skill set that maybe is not entrepreneurial, but they're contributing to society? Maybe they thrive in stability versus spontaneity, and they can ace a job interview, but they don't want to do that every single morning. So I'm just curious what your perspective is on that and what your advice is.
What I would just say, I think it's I think it's good to just we have to define diversity in terms of we have to encompass more people. So to your point about extroversion and introversion, an open office plan is not good for introverts who need their space, and it's draining for them to be around others. I don't know. Humans, again, technology has changed us in a lot of ways, but a lot of the core of what a human is and how we interact, hasn't really changed that much. And so I don't know that changes in the workforce necessarily imply that people of a certain ilk, right, introverts, or people who like homeostasis are going to fare poorly in whatever comes next, because it's not just extroverts designing the workforce of the future.
Steelcase has done a whole line of really wonderful stuff around the introverts. So check out the company Steelcase. Yes?
I was going to say one other thing, which is I think this is important for all of us who talk in terms of trends and sort of talk in terms of big narrative, which helps us make sense of the world and is really important. But we have a $19 trillion economy in the U.S. It's big, it's messy. There'll be all kinds of organizations, I think, where people Lee are describing will, if they know their own strengths and what they're comfortable doing, they'll find plenty of good places to work. If they're well-trained and educated, they'll be able to plug in. It's not like traditional organizations are completely disappearing tomorrow. This is a long evolution, and there will be plenty of big organizations still around, in 2090 or whatever. I'm quite sure.
Yeah.
I'm not as sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, well, maybe.
30-second
Final
point.
remark from Steve.
30-second point, 10-second point. You will find, even in open environments, you're going to find that balance between the stability and certainty. I want my desk right here, and I don't want to move around. So, I mean, even as I'm thinking about the tactical things that we're doing in our office, exactly what we're creating, because we do have people who, they want their routines. They don't want them disturbed. That's how they work most effectively. They have to be celebrated, too.
Well, thank you again to our fantastic panel. Thanks to you for all of your great engagement. And look forward to the future.
Paul, can't wait for the book.
Copy of my book.